Welcome to Co-Branded, your go-to source for brand strategy, design, and business insights.
Whether you're just starting out or leveling up, we're here to help you build your brand with confidence.
Let's dive in. So Zuza,
Hi, Josh.
how's it going?
Good.
Good.
How are you?
I am good. I'm very good.
Very good. Good.
Good and good.
Uh-huh. I think that if this was about SEO, then we would probably be on the first page of Google when people say good.
Good, yeah.
Mhm.
The goodness.
The goodness.
Cool.
So actually, let's talk about good brand guidelines.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Awesome.
So what are brand guidelines? What is it? Is it the same as a style guide?
Not exactly. There's a lot of overlap in terms of a style guide, but style guides are usually specific about a use case of a brand, or a lot of times we'll use style guides for particular implementations of assets or marketing creative. But the brand guidelines is a bigger document, or a broader document is probably a better word, to kind of go over the really critical pieces about that particular brand to make sure that the usage of those assets are consistent across different touch points, across different vendors, so that way the brand itself is being portrayed in the same way every time it's used.
So fonts and colors?
Absolutely. Yeah, the fonts, colors, typography. Again, we'll get into a deeper conversation about the differences between those in a different episode. Photography usage, illustration usage, the different ways that the logo can and cannot be used. But also beyond just the visual assets, it's a lot of information about the tone of voice and the personality and the different aspects about how the brand is spoken to in the audience. And it can even have deeper things in terms of who the actual audience is, what it's for, stuff like that.
Okay. I have to agree with you this time.
This time. We'll disagree later.
Well, but I also want to touch, first of all, I think we should list out the most important components of a brand guideline, Bible, book, whatever we want to call it.
Okay.
Strategy would be the first one, right? So I'm assuming that is the biggest difference between brand guidelines and the style guide.
Sure.
Okay. So strategy, what goes into strategy? What kind of things are we putting in a brand guideline book?
Yeah, it depends on how much strategy the organization has actually done, but all of it that applies to the public facing brand of that organization. As we talked about in a different episode, the why, what, and how, the brand personality, potentially the brand archetypes, the voice and tone, writing and style guides in terms of how you speak and how you write about the organization, boilerplate statements, all that kind of information can go into that guide.
Can you explain boilerplate statements?
Yeah, so a boilerplate statement is a repeatable phrase. So it's almost like an elevator pitch of your organization, but you can have different formats or different versions of that. There could be a very short one, which again is like your just quick pitch. Like, what do you do? This is what we do. And then you can have a little bit longer version, or maybe even a version that you put at the end of press releases or marketing materials. But the idea is that it's a consistent statement that you use for your organization that's the same everywhere. And that can be updated and changed, but it's a little bit more rigid than that. It's meant to be, this is how we speak about our organization in this 1 to 4 sentence statement.
Got it. Okay. So basically you could say that the brand guideline document or book or whatever you want to call it, the Bible, right, is a user manual for someone to use everything that's connected with that particular brand, right?
Yes, everything is probably a strong word, only because there are a lot of things that don't exist in this document. It's primarily from certainly a visual standpoint about what the brand is from a logo and color perspective, but then also that really kind of high level marketing strategy and brand strategy perspective. Operations, things like that doesn't really live in this document. It's much more for the marketing and creative teams, as well as anytime you work with outside vendors that need to use your logo for a particular event or a promotional thing. You'll want them to make sure that they're properly representing your logo the way it should be or the way that you deemed it to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is extremely valuable.
Absolutely.
So speaking of value, I kind of want to make a twist here. And can you think of an example? Do you have an example of what happens when a brand does not have brand guidelines?
Well, I was actually going to ask you that question. So I'm going to flip it back. I'm going to double flip it.
Okay.
So yeah. So do you have an example? Because I want your perspective on this as well. You talked about what I think brand guidelines are. And I know that you do a lot of them and work with a lot of clients that require them or want them for their organization. So I'd love to get your perspective on what they are and kind of the value behind them.
Well, so first of all, I have to say that I really appreciate clients who come to me with an understanding of what that document is, give or take. They don't have to know every single thing, but they appreciate it. They know why they need it. And the reality of it is that trying to design anything, and I'm not even talking about just graphic design, but putting together messaging or putting together the types of content that you're going to share and how you're going to share, how you're going to talk about yourself. Okay, all these things, it is very difficult, very time consuming, and completely inconsistent when you don't have those guidelines and you try to make it up as you go. Sure. And I see this a lot in companies where people, designers, the marketing team, first of all, they're not connected, and they're not connected, through an understanding of what the brand is. Mm-hmm. But they also try to recreate the wheel every time they sit down to design something, and that is a complete waste of time. So another thing to keep in mind is when you have the brand guidelines established, you can scale. And that is not only a time saver, but that is, exponential value that you're bringing to the client, because then they can go on and say, okay, we're hiring people. Any designer, any photographer. I actually just wrapped up a super fun project in Madison. Hi, I hope you're doing well. One of my favorite clients. And so he sells straps for watches that are, high end and sophisticated. But we were thinking about one of the reasons why his bounce rate was really high from his website was photography. He tried taking photos himself, which is great. But if you're not a professional photographer and you're selling something at a higher price point, you want that to match. That is a branding decision, but it's also a sales decision. We looked specifically for photographers who specialize in watches, which is interesting. There's a whole world out there. But interestingly enough, we put together several pages of information about what kind of lighting we're looking at, what kind of detail shots, storytelling behind it, what kind of colors, what kind of textures, all these things. We don't want to be prescriptive. We don't want to say, hey, photographer, this is exactly what I want you to do. But we want to say, this is how you need to do it so that it's on brand. Sure. And this is the shot list and all the things that we need. So ultimately, if it doesn't work out with a photographer, he can take that information, he can take that book and run with it with someone else.
Yeah. And I think that is a really good point about why brand guidelines are valuable, is because it allows you to create consistency in what you're doing. And like you said, it's not just a brand decision, it's also a sales decision in terms of we're selling a particular type of product to a particular audience and it needs to represent a particular way. I'm going to try to use particular again a little bit later, see how many times I can get into this episode.
I'll start counting.
I think it's important that it's not a tool just for designers. It's a tool for anybody in that organization to understand what that organization looks like or talks like or feels like. Feel is a tricky word to use, but it really has an impact on the brand recognition that you're using for your audience. So yeah, so that was one point, and we'll probably cover more as we talk a little bit more about it, but keep going. I'm interested to hear more.
I really want to use the word particular, but I can't think of anything. I'm sorry. So interestingly enough, when you were talking about the brand guidelines and how that helps in general, it's not only for internal teams to understand the brand, also it's to be invested. So I know it might sound a little bit weird, but it's the same idea to me. It's the same idea as a company that has a logo designed by nephew of the CEO's old friend.
Okay.
And to me, that is information that they don't want to invest in their brand.
Why should business owners specifically invest in their brand? Maybe slightly off topic in terms of brand guidelines. I think it's related because brand guidelines helps you establish the use case of a brand once you've invested in it. But I think it's an important aspect of, if I'm a business owner and I'm working with Zuza at Nicely Made, and you want to say, hey, we need to create brand guidelines, why? Why do I need this?
Because you do. No, just kidding. So many reasons. Well, first of all, consistency saves you so much time because you're not overthinking your decisions. Should we be using this colors? And you would be actually surprised by how many business owners don't have any brand guidelines, and it's just like literally throwing darts in the dark. And it is so time consuming and it's so painful. And when you talk to them, you can feel their pain. They're like, oh my gosh, I've been trying to DIY this. It's like, you can DIY it and maybe it's going to be successful, but if you don't have any guidelines, you don't have any rules, then it's going to be very difficult.
So before we move on to the next point, or the next point that you're going to say, let me repeat that back to you to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly, is that building brand guidelines allows for more consistency in the creative or the marketing that you're doing for your brand. And then it actually allows you to move faster, which, again, as we know, saves time and money if you can do things faster, because you're not trying to reinvent it every time. You have kind of a set formula for this is how things should go, whether that's color or photography or type treatments, things like that. So actually makes the business owner be able to move faster in those scenarios.
Yes, absolutely. And so I'm thinking about campaigns. When we have a company that has established brand guidelines and they are well established and well socialized so that people actually understand what they're reading and why this is the way it is. There's the visual side of things of how we communicate. And that's, to me, is more of a big picture, high level thinking, way of thinking, right? That's the creative direction.
So from a designer perspective, if a creative is working on something, it's a part of having kind of the baseline understanding of what the brand is in terms of colors, typography, photography. But then you'll work on brand guidelines that have a little bit deeper layout stylistic approaches, so that way people understand how to use the elements across the brand. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So for example, you can have a color palette and you can have typography and you can have illustration style. But then when you start putting, let's say that this brand is a little bit more rebellious. So you have these big elements and they overlap, right? And there's a little bit of chaos. That creates a whole nother message. Then we use a lot of white space. Everything is aligned. You know what I mean? Everything is calm. Like, you can use the same elements in so many different ways and therefore communicating different things. But I don't know if I necessarily want to talk about like just a visual identity side of things, because there are plenty of examples of really well-known brands that have.
Sure. Yeah.
Right?
There's beautiful, beautiful brand guidelines out there. It's
right.
It's almost an art form in and of itself, you know, if the company or the designer wants to spend the time doing those things.
Yes. So actually on that, I just want to say that depending on the brand I'm working with, I will also create a different style guide. So for example, if I'm working with a brand who is funny, you know, playful, then I'm actually going to put that language in the style guide too. So for example, we had the logo usage and you always put errors, right? Like, don't do this. And I put something like, don't stretch the logo. Or at the end, says something like, don't do anything that you wouldn't want to be done to yourself. You know what I mean? Like stuff like that. But the thing about it is, when you're reading the brand guide, and to me, this is a document that
represent the brand.
Exactly. It's like talking to the best representation of the brand. To me, a brand guide should be read and not just looked at.
Sure.
Right?
I think that's a good understanding of what they are. How do you go about creating them? What are the things that a designer or a business owner needs to kind of understand, or at least have, cool, these are the things that we need in there? Because again, I think it's important to touch on the topic of they can be large depending on the organization or the use case of it. If you have a multinational organization that works across different countries, there's going to be variance into what you can or cannot do. If you have a small sandwich shop, it's probably much smaller. Like, you don't need the same robustness that you would for a large organization, because they're probably doing much less marketing or in less touch points than some of these organizations. But how do you go about setting it up? What are kind of the core key principles that you do when you create your brand guidelines?
This particular moment, I think, is really good for me to say that I disagree with you.
Okay.
Well, yes, the more corporate of an environment we have, usually the more, I mean, I'm kind of don't want to use the word more robust and more detailed. We would assume that that's the way it is, but then you can also assume that big organizations work with in-house designers, right?
Okay. Why wouldn't in-house designers want brand guidelines though?
Why would they, or
why wouldn't they?
Why wouldn't they want it?
Don't you want brand guidelines for internal and external uses?
You do. You absolutely do. The only thing is, there is no right or wrong, right, as far as creating a brand guideline. There's not one template that you have to use, and this is the best way to do this. It depends on what this brand needs. And I have seen creative directors who would want the smallest little details laid out in the style guide so that everything is consistent. But the problem with that is that is stifling. How can I ever create something original within the brand if it's so specific? Then it becomes like a technology manual for your TV. You know what I mean? Like, So there's a balance, and we have to find that balance between creativity and consistency. And sometimes it's harder to find than,
What did you disagree with me about?
I was like, hold on, I have it. No,
I didn't hear a disagreement yet.
You said that if it's a small sandwich shop, then they don't need as much of, I don't know, guidelines. It's not as robust. I don't know if I necessarily agree. That would mean that I kind of disagree.
Okay, so give me reasons why they need more.
I'm not saying they need more. I'm just saying that the size of a company does not mean that you need more or less brand guidelines.
Yeah, I guess we disagree. For instance, from my perspective, let's say you have a single designer or a single business owner. They have more innate understanding of what they want it to be like than if you had a team of 7 or a team of 100. Mm-hmm. So I do think if you have larger teams, they become critical that you have these really well-established brand guidelines. I think if you have a much, much smaller team, a couple people, there's more fluidity and it's easier to be on the same page without having these kind of, regimented or rule sets. But I think they're really important in that sense because we talked about earlier, you're not having to rethink it every time, regardless of the size of the team.
Sure.
And even as I'm talking about this, I could make the argument that a small business needs more brand guidelines because they have a million other things that they need to do. So this becomes this really powerful tool for them to be like, cool, I know what we're doing here. Let's knock it out and move on. So I like the point that you made about the shouldn't be so prescriptive. And I think that's a really good word because I think in your brand, it should be consistent, but there should be room for growth or exploration or variance and depending on what you're doing. Just purely from a creative side, I want to have the ability to do those things. But consistency is key, regardless of how you're representing that consistency, having the same messaging, having the same understanding that the feeling you get from a brand should be consistent no matter what. But there should be room to play. Yeah.
See, so I was right. Sorry, mic drop. No, just kidding. But I really like what you said. And it's kind of interesting because when you think about brand guidelines and the consistency, why is the consistency so important to the business owner and the brand and the company? But before you answer, I want to, have we talked about Flowdesk ever?
As a brand? I think briefly, but not on the podcast.
Okay. So Flowdesk is a fascinating thing for me because I'm looking at even their social media. When you look at everything that they're putting together, you're like, what is this? Like so many different typefaces, so many different colors, so many different layouts, so many different approaches to design. But you know what? And yet they are all consistent. Why? Because there's some sort of a bigger idea of creativity, but good taste, good design skills that connect all of these things, right? So when you see it, you know this is Flowdesk, even though you don't always have to use the same typeface. All these rules, and maybe that's on brand for them, breaking those rules. But whatever it is, you know that someone made the effort to think about the bigger picture and then how that's going to translate. And it's not always going to have to be the same.
Yeah. So I will put a big disclaimer, maybe we can do it on the video, disclaimer that most brands probably aren't equipped to have that chaotic of a brand because it's tricky to pull that off.
Sure.
It takes a lot of thought and understanding and intention behind being able to merge those different types of styles to create this consistent feeling. It's awesome when it can be done right, but I think a lot of businesses just aren't equipped to do that.
Sure.
But to answer your question about consistency, I'm a huge proponent of consistency in branding because I think it solves a few things. One is for your audience, or if you're selling a product or a message or whatever it is, if the audience doesn't have a consistent experience across the different touch points, you're going to lose that brand recognition. You're going to lose that brand trust because they experience one thing and they're like, hey, this was really great. I really resonate with this, or I believe in the message, or this was a great deal. And they immediately go have a different experience in another aspect of your brand, whether it's a different touch point, a website, or in store. It doesn't necessarily matter. But if you have inconsistency in those touch points, you can't build brand loyalty, regardless of what your brand is. That consistency is really important. As we're talking about, you can expand upon what those things are as long as that feeling and experience are somewhat and ideally very consistent from one touch point to the next.
I do have to agree with you. Okay, so One. Okay, so several things. As an example of like something every day, it's almost as if you had a social media account with someone who works out all the time and promotes a healthy lifestyle. And then you go to their website and they're eating a burger and fries. It's like, would you want to call them and ask for personal training? I don't know. So that's exactly what it is. And the thing we talked about recently is the number of times that a brand has to show themselves to a potential consumer is a lot more than one. If, let's say, 10, right? Let's say I have to bombard you 10 times with some sort of information that comes from my brand for you to even acknowledge that my brand even exists.
Mm-hmm.
So if 6 of those times are consistent with my brand and 4 are not, it's not even that you're not going to trust me consciously. You're just not even going to understand that it's the same brand. So there's a lot of value there to brands having.
Yeah. So we've come back to consistency quite a few times in terms of the brand guidelines consistently.
Mm-hmm.
If we've come back to consistency consistently for brand guidelines, I think that's a really important aspect. What I do think the time saver, you can be faster, you can make less mistakes, less time trying to figure it out, and just kind of this is what we're doing. So it's important to go. But so to kind of jump back, I guess, a couple questions ago, is there a certain set of things that you just absolutely need in terms of a brand guidelines? What's like the baseline brand guidelines? So that way, whether it's a creative working with a new brand or whether it's a business owner saying, okay, these are things we need to at least have some level of consistency. What are those things?
Okay, so the absolute minimum viable product for a micro business, sometimes it's just a single person, would be a brand board. And on that brand board, we would have color palette, typography, types of images, but also brand personality. It's not even necessarily the messaging, but the personality, because from that personality, right, you can deduct how to an extent, how to communicate. That's the absolute minimum. And
even that will provide value, like a starting point. Because I do think it's important as anybody starting out, whether it's a designer or a business owner, being like, oh, another thing that I have to create or another thing I have to invest in.
It will save you so much pain.
And that's important, but it's also how much do they need to get into it? It's important that a brand guideline will scale and adjust over time as your brand develops or as the organization grows, or maybe even if there is a little bit of a rebrand or a pivot or change in what they're doing, like the brand guideline should obviously reflect those changes. So it's not a stagnant, you build it once, you put it away in a drawer, but it's something that as your brand evolves, this is something that comes along with it.
Yes, I have to agree with you. And that's also why we put the dates. We put revised December 2024 or March 2025, whatever that is, right? So that people understand when this was revised. And, it's expanding, it's growing, which is normal. But going back to your question, actually trying to answer your questions, brand guidelines would consist of brand strategy. And to me, that would be positioning. What they do, positioning, who they do this for, personality, tone and voice, and then the visual identity.
Okay. So the stuff that we had in the brand board, that would come across and be a little bit more of a robust implementation of that.
Yep.
And how often do you recommend somebody revisiting it in terms of, is that something they should do quarterly? Is it like just as the brand evolves?
I don't think there is any point in doing something for the sake of doing it. So I definitely don't want to put a timestamp on it. There are certain things that change over time. If it's positioning, if it's the customer we're talking to, if we're implementing new strategies, if we're adding new products, or if we decided that maybe this is time to really understand the brand because the people within the brand have changed. There has to be some sort of friction, to me, in order for someone to start updating it.
Okay, that's good. From a business owner perspective or from creative perspective, it's not something that they're going to constantly have to revisit. It should be, This is our brand, this is how we go. And then as the brand changes or evolves, that's when it's like, okay, cool, we need to update this because we have a whole new sliver of audience or a totally new product line or things like that.
Yeah. And then I also think that it's really interesting, but with the moment you start working with a brand, you don't necessarily have all the answers yet. And this actually happened to one of my clients. She creates mocktails for active and healthy people. Such a cool product. But we actually started with the packaging, and it's very difficult to design something without a style guide, but the way that this process went was it was the other way around. So we first created the packaging, and then we created the brand style guide, brand guidelines, because we agreed that style guide is more of a visual thing.
Yeah.
So the thing about it is that as you're creating a brand guidelines book, you have to make a lot of decisions. You have to make decisions about the colors. You have to make decisions about the fonts, but you also have to make decisions or get that information somehow. But oftentimes the brands don't even know what their positioning really is. They don't know what their personality really is, like all these things. But we put together a guide so that all of these things came together. What is that going to look like on the website? What is that's going to relate to the packaging? How that's going to relate to marketing materials? How is that going to translate onto social media, right? Like all these things. And how do we want to talk about ourselves? We came up with this guilt-free because it's a mocktail. So you're not drinking alcohol, but then you feel good the next day. So you don't have to feel guilty. But that's another spin. And that's another element that we put in there. But the client loved it. And I was so excited because she sent me a message and she's like, oh my gosh, like it all works, right? And then you can really see the big picture. Mm-hmm. You can see how the brand unravels. But again, it's a lot of decisions.
So from this exercise that you did with your client in terms of creating the brand guidelines, and it does sound like there's a decent amount of the style guide within that. That gave her a viewpoint of what the brand will look like going forward. So even from that aspect of it, it has a value that it's painting a picture of what this is going to look like across these different touch points as they're needed or as they're created.
Yes,
okay,
absolutely. Cool. So that also brings me to a question that I have for you. Printing or digital brand guidelines?
Are you asking me which one you do? I would say I haven't probably printed a brand guidelines unless it was for a large organization in a very long time. One, I think it makes it more accessible. If there's a digital version that can be accessed very quickly, whether it's from a website or if it's a PDF that you just share with vendors or new designers, it's cheaper to just do digital. It's not another expense that you have to print out this book. But if you are investing heavily into what this brand guidelines is, if you have a lot of vendors that you work with or a lot of agencies, this is primarily a little bit maybe more on the larger organization side, it can be a really powerful branding tool to present this guidelines to a partner. Because to your early point, it shows that you care about your brand and about how you appear in front of your audiences and the time that you invested and, the financial aspect you've invested in creating your brands. General rule, I'd probably say digital, across the board, 80% or more. And then for those rare cases where you really want to hit it home or really have this really kind of almost showpiece of your brand, then you probably do an unprinted version of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, I came across both. I definitely would do digital over printed. Money, paper, sustainability, environment, quick changes, accessibility.
Yeah, there's a huge aspect of it. If you print it out, every time you make a change, you have to print a new one. It's right. And that alone is,
And lastly, also, what I've been doing is I always include links to the folders where the assets live, right? So so when they see, for example, this is how to use photography and like sample photography is included here, boom. Logo files here, boom. Yeah. So that everything is like a single point of truth. And honestly, I've gone through a messaging exercise with a brand strategist for my own business. And funny enough, theoretically, all these things, but then when I sit down and I try to write my content, I'm like, hold on, where was it?
Yeah.
Because I need it. Yeah. And that actually validates in a weird way what I'm trying to say. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, it's in the guide, right?
Yeah.
And it's just, it's such an easier process because of it. Like,
that's a big, specifically that is the reason why you create boilerplate statements, is that you're not trying to recreate it every time or try to think about what word you used here instead of this word. And, it does make it easier, it makes it faster, which saves you time and money. It's just a really important tool. In terms of, let's say I'm a new designer coming into an organization that either A, doesn't have brand guidelines or does have brand guidelines. I guess those are probably two separate conversations, but as a new designer or as a new designer in a particular organization, what are the ways that they can take the brand guidelines and help them do their job better? Obviously, it will depend on the brand guidelines themselves because that will dictate a lot of it. But are there any tips or tricks that the best bang for the buck? Like, how do you get the most out of a brand guideline? And I don't even know if that's a reasonable question. I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
I love that. I would like to answer your reasonable or unreasonable question, but I don't know where the question was. I got lost.
Okay. Yeah, I did ramble a bit, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
So as a designer coming into an organization, how do I use the brand guidelines to the best of my ability as a new designer in this brand guidelines? Like, how do I take the brand guidelines and use that to improve my work?
You take the brand guidelines and you use them.
No, that's a terrible answer.
I'm sorry. No, well, and again, I think this is also a good conversation to have with your creative director, and I hope you do have one. If you are just starting out, oftentimes you'll come into an agency, or not a marketing agency, but, organization or a company where there is no creative direction. And that is actually an opportunity for you to say, hey, I see that we're using all these things. How can we streamline this? I think this would be very valuable for this reason. Pushing changes when you're here to hear is always difficult, and that's just the way that life is, but it's also a really good opportunity. But in terms of using it, I
was being a little facetious, but like, using it is the right answer, right? I mean, it's just
yes and no, because I feel like we're coming back to the how prescriptive is it, right? Or how prescriptive does it need to be? I've been in a situation where there was a style guide or brand guidelines that were established many years before I got on board. And then I was asked to update it or expand it because the brand identity has shifted a little bit. But it was unclear to what extent, meaning how prescriptive do you want this? But it's not even a matter of how prescriptive do you want this. How prescriptive do we need to get to help the brand communicate better, right? So that is the biggest question. And I think that that's the first thing that you should think about as a new designer. What can I do to streamline things? Where are the hangups? Where are we wasting time? Where do we want to pull our hair out? Is this? So. No,
that's good. And again, I said it was kind of maybe an unreasonable question because it's kind of like, well, just use them, right? Like that's what it's there for. But it's, like you said, the prescriptiveness of the brand is really important in terms of those aspects about what ability you have to work within these boundaries. And I know designers say, I want full creativity, but that's just not true. Like, we want a box, but we want it to be a generally comfy box, not a really tight box. You want some rules to get, some walls to hit against, because then you can be creative within that limitation. As creatives, at least in my experience, I've had this plenty of times where I'm just like, do anything you want. I'm like, oh, there's too many options. Give me a little bit of regulations, and then I'll make something really cool, because then I can work within it. But no, that's cool. Is there anything else that we haven't covered in terms of why brand guidelines, how brand guidelines, what brand guidelines?
I don't know. Ultimately, I think the biggest takeaway is, how do you make them? Please understand that there is no one way. And I do really sincerely think that the scale of it depends on the need and the value, right? The value that the client gets out of it. I've been lucky to work with clients who really do understand and appreciate the value of working with something like that. And they want it. And they want me to create something that will give them rules so that and whenever they send it to printers, whenever they send it to photographers, designers, copywriters, everything is in it.
Yeah.
And it's just very easy to align everyone on a team.
Yeah. It creates consistency. It allows you to move faster. It's a tool that makes sure you don't have to question things. It's just, this is what we do, and this is why we do it, and this is how we do it. So go do it.
Yeah, and go do it. Absolutely.
Cool. I think that is a good summary of brand guidelines, and hopefully people found it valuable and
I hope
understand why they're important. They're not just a designer, ooh, let's build this.
Even though that's fun.
I was just saying, they're still fun to make, because it allows you to take all the work that you did for branding and then put it into this document that, look at this brand. It's a really good way to see the result of all that work. Like, this is our brand now. Yeah. But to your point of your client, it also allowed her to see what the brand is after the work that you did together. So I think it's important.
I agree. And the last thing I'm going to say about this is, there's also the emotional component of it. She was able to see that it all will make sense. And now she's fired up. Yeah. She's excited about it, right? There's a vision, because they can imagine it right on the shelf. So it's a really good way to take something that is still ephemeral and make it a living, tangible thing. And I love that.
Perfect. I think that's it.
Mic drop.
Yep. Cool. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I will see you next time.
Sounds good.
Bye. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, your brand story is yours to define.
Follow us at Co-Branded for more tips and strategies. Stay curious, stay creative, and we'll catch you next time.